Just to give you an overview, I'm Matt Sumner. I work at Anchor here. We've taken this meetup over recently, so in the last sort of month, and the reason was at Anchor we work with Magento pretty heavily, so we thought there was definitely a fit. Anchor hosts 10 or 12 different meetups. If you haven't been to any before, we host something called Port 80, which is a sort of web industry thing. We host everything from Ansible, Docker, OpenStack, Drupal, etc. So we wanted to host Magento and give a bit of an input back to the community. It's got an existing base of 300 people. Obviously there's not 300 people here now. It was run a little bit sporadically before. We want to do it every month, so it's great to see everyone here now. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'll tell everyone where the toilets are. So toilets are just over here. If you can try to stay within this area, we've still got people working here. Obviously, sysadmin's doing the thing. We're going to have pizza at 7:30. So what we're going to do is we're going to have two talks. We're going to have Christian Larson, our CTO from Anchor's, going to do his talk that he did at Imagine around ending your deployment nightmares. So he did that in Vegas back in May? April. So he's going to sort of do a revamp of that talk, keep it down to about 20 minutes or so with a Q&A afterwards. And then we're going to have Mark Binns from Acid Green. So Acid Green are our sponsors tonight, great web dev agency out of Sydney. Have a talk to them. We've got the guys here tonight. Mark's going to do a talk. He's digital marketing manager for them. He's going to do a talk based on SEO, and we're going to do a Q&A at the end of that. And then there's going to be an opportunity for everyone just to have a chat, eat some pizza, and have a few drinks. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll hand over to Christian and he can kick off the talk.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Cool. All right, thanks Matt. As Matt said, I'm the CTO of Anchor. I won't go through the spiel since you already did. But yes, this is the same talk I gave at Magento Imagine in Vegas. Probably before I get started, it would be helpful to know, although the talk's already written, if you had to identify yourself as being either a technical person or a non-technical person, what would you do? So anyone who identifies as a technical person in the room, would you mind putting your hands up? Okay. Good enough? It's a reasonably technical talk, but I hope there'll still be some takeaways for those of you who aren't here from that side. Before we get started, I will start with a bit of a gimmick and some obligatory audience participation to get everyone moving. I'll start by asking a question, and I'll ask you to raise your hand and keep it raised until the answer is no longer yes. The question is, how frequently do you release to production? Now, is the answer once ever? And I would expect most people to be able to put their hand up right now. Yep. Is it once a quarter? Once a month? Once a week? Once a day? Down to maybe half a dozen? What about multiple times a day? Right, still a reasonably good number there. Those people who just had your hands up at the end, could you raise them again? Everyone who doesn't have your hand up, can you look at the people with their hands raised? They're going to out-innovate you in the marketplace. Put your hands down now. So the purpose of this talk is to explain why that's the case and what you can do to perhaps catch up in that respect. Another question, and don't raise your hands. Godzilla just struck. It just wiped out all of the services, servers, and data that is running your online store. How long will it take you to actually get that back online? And how confident will you be that it's going to be working exactly the same as it was before? Don't worry about pondering that question just yet, but consider it as we move forward. So to facilitate my argument, I have some placeholder people called Alice and Bob. They're not very interesting, but will suffice. Alice and Bob both work for the same digital agency. Alice is an intrepid developer not long out of university. She's quite pleasant, everyone gets along with her. She's assigned to do maintenance work just for one client full time, so she's associated with them and has a fairly good relationship. Bob, on the other hand, is an operations manager for this organization. So Bob deals with lots of clients, lots of servers, performs a sysadmin role for pretty much the entire organization. And historically, Bob and Alice don't really get along very well. At the same time, that's not an issue for them because they don't have to interact all that often. So as I mentioned, Alice does full-time maintenance for one client. So currently, Alice has a fairly simple process for putting things into production. She is allowed to push to production once a month. Unfortunately for her, it's on a Friday at 6 p.m. because that's the client's lowest period of activity. But again, it's once a month, not too bad. Her current process, it's not all that complicated. In fact, in Anchor's experience, this is probably pretty average of most development organizations. So she works with her revision control system. She works with the client throughout the month to work in any bug fixes or features that they want, iterates, checks everything into revision control. When she's happy with something she thinks is release ready, she'll FTP it up to her staging environment, make a few tweaks, and then get the client sign off. On that Friday at 6 p.m, when Alice would much rather be out partying, instead she's up FTPing code to production, making the same tweaks and putting things live. So this process is okay, but it's not ideal. For starters, the deployments are pretty slow and tedious right now, so it's still a very manual process. Likewise, after Alice has done that push to production and made the tweaks that she needs to, her client still has to go and verify all of the changes manually. So the client actually has a bunch of developers or a bunch of testers there sitting there and clicking buttons to make sure the site still works, make sure they can still transact, searching still works, all that sort of thing. For context, I worked for a bank a number of years ago. They would release probably once every 3 months. They actually had a team of no less than 20 people who would test for an entire weekend when a release was completed. So this is not an uncommon thing in the industry. So look, this works okay, but the other problem Alice has is that some of her deployments aren't successful. So she suffers from a worked-in staging syndrome. This is often the case that she'll introduce some problems as a consequence of the deployment, or maybe it's something she hasn't foreseen. And the other big one is that old bugs still rear their head, so she still suffers from regressions. The client will have a look, and as they're testing something with a production release, the client will say, oh hey, we found this bug that we saw 6 months ago, wasn't this fixed? So this still happens from time to time. What about Bob? Bob, as I mentioned, is the agency's operations member. He does a lot of work for a lot of clients. Bob actually has a fairly similar process. So Bob is often the one you'll call when you need a new service to use or a configuration change to be made on the machines. Bob knows that deploying things into production willy-nilly and manually is not a great idea, so he actually tracks all of his work in a revision control system as well. So he'll write automations to conduct changes. When Bob needs to roll out a change, he'll generally try to write the automation, roll it into staging, perform his own testing, because no one really cares much what Bob does so long as it gets there. And if he's happy, he'll bolt it onto production. As you can see, based on what I'm trying to convey in my diagrams, it's a little bit ad hoc and not very pretty. So it's not ideal for Bob either. Bob's changes are slow and tedious. Despite the fact that he's writing some automations to actually execute the work, he still has to write the automations each time. Again, Bob also sometimes causes outages, so the thing he'll do in staging will work very differently to the thing in production. This can be due to environmental differences, due to the fact that perhaps the configuration will drift from staging to production, or it could be the fact that something's just gone wrong. And likewise, Bob also suffers from regressions. You'll often find that something or a service that worked 6 months ago might also break. But again, Bob doesn't really have to do things very often. He's seldom asked to make changes, so it's not a huge deal. Until this happens. The client's dedicated server had its radiator spring a leak. It's just overheated and combusted. It's Saturday at 5 a.m. So, the client's immediately on the phone to Alice because they've got a really good relationship with her, saying, Alice, the site's down, what's going on? Alice is really shocked. Bob's been paged, so Bob knows something's gone wrong, and he's rushing into the data center to have a look. What's going to happen is Bob's going to have to actually go and rack up a new machine because the existing one is combusted, and Alice is going to have to do a new deployment. Understandably, no one's really happy in this scenario, so the client obviously has their store down. For some reason, Saturday at 5 AM is their high transaction period, so they're actually losing a lot of money right now. Alice has an unhappy client on the phone to her, which is not pleasant for anybody, and Bob's just been paged at 5 AM on Saturday to run into the data center. So Bob's racked up the new server. Alice has performed a deployment. I don't know if you can remember the prior slide, but things just look a slight bit different now. So the site, unfortunately, isn't working properly. Bob's followed his same processes, so he's applied all of his same automations to get the machine running. And Alice has performed a deployment in the exact same way she always does. Alice and Bob spend the rest of Saturday trying to work out what happened here and what's going wrong. Finally, by the end of Saturday, they've worked out and resolved all the issues. Turned out that Bob had made an emergency change in production last week and hadn't documented it, nor had he backported it to his automations. So he had to go and remember that. And likewise, Alice. Alice was actually relying on a library that was no longer on the machine anymore. In fact, it wasn't part of her release. It was an existing artifact of an older release that just happened to be on the machine. So this wasn't part of her deployment. But the site's now up. Unfortunately, there are still some problems. The client obviously is very unhappy. They're raising things like SLAs and asking how much they're entitled to. They want all of their money back for the transactions that they didn't get. Likewise, what we built looks a little bit different to the old thing. So how do we have confidence that it's going to keep working in the same way? We've just gone and made a lot of manual changes on a Saturday at an emergency. Are we going to be sure that our processes are going to continue to work as time goes on? And the other annoying thing now is that we think we've resolved all the issues, but the client's now finding some new bugs that we've never seen before. Unfortunately, no one knows if the bugs were there last week or if they're being discovered simply because everyone's looking at the problem now. So what could Alice have done better, or what went wrong for Alice? Some people might say nothing. It was all Bob's fault because Bob looks after the infrastructure and the radiator exploded. Unfortunately, that's not an excuse, nor is it an argument. Eventually, Alice would have had to have done a fresh deployment somewhere, either due to a change in business requirement, maybe they changed service providers, or perhaps the server would have needed to have been refreshed. Regardless, Alice would have had to have done a fresh deployment, perhaps under some more controlled circumstances, but it would have happened. So we'll try again. What could have Alice done better? Alice had a few problems. Firstly, she had no confidence in the quality of her code, or at least the process she was using. Whilst it was working previously, it wasn't very robust. The client was discovering new bugs, and Alice couldn't really accurately say if they were there before or if they were new. It's also very slow. So this process, again, is largely manual. That means that inevitably errors are going to happen, and errors require rework. And the most important, or the biggest problem here, was actually mutability. Alice was layering new code over the top of old code, so she kept mutating her existing code base. I spoke before of that undocumented library she was dependent upon. She didn't actually know that was a requirement for her application. This was a big issue. So a few months down the line, Alice decided that she never really wanted a repeat of that horrible Saturday. And she doesn't really like dealing with Bob very much, so she didn't want any more excuses to have to talk to him. So she's changed her process. Rather than going and manually FTPing her code up to production, she's actually built a pipeline, or an automated deployment pipeline. She's actually gone and built automations that will actually go and build her code, test it for her, and finally, if she's happy, it'll even deploy it to staging or production as per business requirements. This is great for Alice, but the thing I'd like to highlight right this moment is actually the very important thing up the top left, which is that artifact. I might just digress here for a minute. So in this context, I'm talking about build artifacts. In software development, artifacts can refer to a number of things. It could be a document, the output of a manual process, but in this context, I'm talking about software build artifacts. These have a few properties. The first is that they're automatically built, so generally speaking, a robot will go and generate this for you. Secondly, generated once. So for every release, or let's say we tie this back to our revision control system, for every hash in our, or every Git object we have, we'll only generate one artifact. We won't generate many, we won't generate one for each environment, we'll generate one artifact. And finally, they're immutable, so they can't change. This is an important property because it means that modulo changes to perhaps environments or servers or external infrastructure. The testing that you perform on one artifact should be relevant no matter where it is. So that could be testing, staging, production. It's important to note too that this doesn't need to be a complicated process. A build artifact could be something as simple as a tarball or a zip file of your code, or it could be as complicated as a statically compiled binary or an executable that you'll roll out later. So what has Alice achieved? Her focus on automation is actually the big advantage here. She's able to deploy higher quality code, so she has a lot more confidence in her process. It's faster. A robot is inevitably going to be more quick at doing this than a human is. And finally, and probably the biggest one, the client over time has started to see the success of Alice's new processes. So they're actually a lot happier with the quality of the work, they're happier with the quality of the release process. What that means is they're actually happier to have Alice go and do deployments in the middle of the day. They say, all right, we want this new feature or this quick bug fix, go and deploy it right now. Alice already has all the automated tests in place to ensure that the fundamental parts of the site are still working, which is great. So this is a huge win for Alice because it means she's reclaimed her Friday nights. Likewise, it's a huge win for the client because they can now work and iterate more quickly. They can get their new features out when they need them rather than on their release date once a month. But let's go back to that fateful Saturday when we had our outage. What went wrong for Bob? Conveniently, for my purposes, a lot of the same things that went wrong for Alice. Bob also suffered a quality problem. So he had poor manual testing of his changes. There was no automation associated with that. It was also slow and manual, so consider the client was using a dedicated machine. That meant that Bob had to actually physically run into the data center and rack a new server. This was something he seldom did, which means that he was out of practice, he didn't have very good procedures, and it took him a long time to get it done. And finally, we have the same problem with regard to mutability. So that dedicated server in production had actually been running for years. It had a lot of undocumented changes made to it over time. And Bob still has no confidence that the new machine running in production looks the same as the old one used to. So a few months down the line, Bob's also changed his processes. In fact, independently, Bob and Alice have been working to build something that looks very similar. Bob now stores all of his changes in a revision control system. He automatically builds them, automatically tests them, and he can automatically deploy them. I speak here also of an artifact. But consider that dedicated servers aren't really a build artifact, so how is Bob achieving this? Infrastructure as code is not a new concept by any means, but still one that a lot of people are adopting and adjusting to. What this generally means is that given the rise of API-driven infrastructure, we can actually now programmatically define the state and existence of our infrastructure. So we can define not only the fact that it exists, but what it looks like and how it's structured. And if we can do that, it means that we can programmatically do so, we can programmatically define it, and if we can programmatically define it, that means we can version it. All of this means that if we go back to Bob's process, Bob can actually version and test his configuration changes. Likewise, he can do this all automatically and establish a very similar pipeline to Alice. It also leads to a very interesting concept called immutable infrastructure. So consider, if I want to make a change to a machine, why should I mutate it? Why not just build a new one? Especially if I have an automated process to do so. So what has Bob accomplished? He has increased quality. He's got a repeatable process now. He doesn't need to go and manually rack a server when he needs to build a new one. Likewise, when he needs to make a change, he's got a pipeline in place that does that for him. He also now deals with cattle rather than pets. Consider The dedicated server in production previously was a pet. He had to care for it. He had to care about its life. He had to, groom it, take it to the cleaners, take it to the vet every now and then to heal it. But if we talk about cattle, the server shouldn't really be that important anymore. So if Bob can get more servers rapidly and doesn't need to worry about how he builds them, that means that when he needs to, Bob can simply kill one off and have it for dinner. And this is great because it means that he can run everything through his build cycle. So what do they do next? Alice and Bob aren't really ready to tie the knot just yet, but they're certainly getting along a lot better. The important thing I want to convey here is that your application is actually a conflation of both the infrastructure and the code base that runs on top of it. They're not distinct things, and you certainly shouldn't treat the infrastructure as a second-class citizen when you talk about your application as a whole. Likewise, it's important that Alice and Bob now share the tools, processes, and responsibilities. So consider the two pipelines I showed you before were still discrete. There's no reason they couldn't be the same thing. So why do you care? Go back to the start of my talk, and I spoke about the people with their hands raised who are going to out-innovate you. That's reason number one. Another good reason is the Godzilla event. Now, I don't really expect giant monsters to come through Sydney anytime soon. However, if you consider all of the recent press around frequent security vulnerabilities, this is probably going to be the next Godzilla event. The number of vulnerabilities discovered is a rising trend, and the next big thing that's going to impact you likely will come. And that's fear-mongering at its finest, but it's still an important consideration. So how do you do it? Talk to your ops guys, talk to your developers, actually make them work together. Increase your focus on the infrastructure. So again, it's not a second-class citizen, it's part of the application, it's part of your store. And do hard things more frequently. Humans are lazy animals. That means that we try to avoid hard things, and if we're forced to do hard things, we'll automate them or make them easy. Now, I spoke before about sort of concepts of automation and speed. Realistically, if you want to achieve those, your primary focus should be quality, going back to doing the hard things more frequently. If you focus on quality, you'll inevitably be forced to automate, and if you're forced to automate, you'll get the velocity that you want, and that's how you'll innovate. Thanks very much.
So Q&A. Anyone got any questions for Christian?
Spectacular.
You covered it that well.
Nice question for that. Have you got some good examples of perhaps sites that you've automated?
Matt Wood.
I'm trying to keep it a bit agnostic. So Anchor has a product called Fleet, which does automate this. We do have a couple of sites. Acid Green themselves use Fleet. So, I don't know what example you want to give. We've got a number of them.
Yep.
Phil?
Sneaky Fisho, natural candle supplies.
There you go. There you go, focus on one. Sneaky Fishos. Any other questions? No?
Cool. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Christian. I failed to mention this earlier, but if you need Wi-Fi, it's available here. So it's Ken has Wi-Fi. That's what you're going to look for, and the password is yes, you can. So we'll welcome Mark up to the stand now with his talk with an astronomically long name: pandas, penguins, and hummingbirds using Magento to tame the digital ecosystem.
I might need a few minutes.
Talk amongst yourselves. Don't make it awkward.
Yeah, I know, that's what I thought too. You guys have really. Last time I was here, I was just head up here and I was around for what about you guys? You guys have done well. So.
It was actually me because I was getting sick.
This is going to be mine. Getting one beer in here. Just finishing up the last. Just finishing up. Couldn't answer. Yeah, just go for it.
Welcome. Hello, mates. How are you? Good. See you.
We can't use a ping pong racket.
Yeah, play people for
Really? Yeah, did someone you must have been to
I know there's not a
Okay. Good evening. Is everyone ready? You all hear me all right? Good evening. If there's only one message that I want you to take home tonight, it's this. There are no shortcuts anymore. Google just got too smart. The days of trying to cheat your way to the top are over. Tonight, I want to share with you some of my own insights, as well as some of the insights from the industry at large, so you can make some informed decisions about your future SEO strategy. With all of the hype surrounding SEO, sometimes it can be difficult to keep up with what are the best practices. If you're not exposed to this every day, it can be hard to identify the tactics that can result in a manual penalty from those which are going to help you to build authority online. In 20 minutes' time, you're going to know the difference between Panda and Penguin. You'll have a better understanding on how Google's ranking works, and you're going to see how it's changed over the years. If nothing else, hopefully you're going to learn enough to question your existing SEO strategy, especially if this hasn't changed in the last 2 years. Tonight, I'm going to be focusing on two main areas. And the first area is the Google algorithm, and the second is how you can optimize your Magento site. So before we get going, I want to start by telling you there's still quite a lot we don't know about Google and how it works. It's not in Google's interest to tell us this information. And the following slides are just an introduction to how the algorithm works. And although there's still a lot more to learn, it's comprehensive enough to give you all you need to know to get the most out of your Magento site. So before we can look at how the algorithm works today, I need to run you through how it used to work and some of the outdated SEO techniques that people are still using today. So back in the day when everything was blue, ranking for a specific key phrase wasn't really that difficult. You just had to optimize the page and put the keywords in the right areas on them and in the meta titles. And then you just had to point as many links as possible at that page using relevant anchor text. You could spin articles using software and placeholder text. And you could post them all over these linked network sites and you'd get fantastic results. SEOs in those days didn't really have to think about the quality of what they were producing. They just had to follow a system. So as I mentioned in the beginning, Google's got a lot smarter now, and the architecture of the algorithm has changed quite a lot. As you can see, you have a core algorithm, and it's supplemented by a number of signals or modules, and these all work together to give you the real-time result. Keeping in mind we're focusing on e-commerce tonight, I'm going to tackle each of these signals in order of priority of which ones affect Magento. The first one I'm going to start with is Panda. So Panda is a specific module that exists within the algorithm, and it exists solely to penalize your site. Panda's all about assessing the quality of the content on your pages. It's trying to identify pages that have little or no value for a user. It looks at a number of factors, and these include the quality of language you use on the page, how clean the code is, and also whether this text has been plagiarized from another site. It's also looking for things like broken text links and broken image links. The problem we have with Panda is it's a review carried out by a machine rather than a person. Sometimes that means it penalizes sites unfairly, which haven't intentionally been breaking the rules. Panda at its core hates duplicate content. And it was built directly to penalize this duplicate content from tiered link building software systems. So the problem we have with Magento is, Magento, unless it's configured correctly, churns out a hell of a lot of duplicate content. And at best, Google's going to ignore this, and at worst, it's going to penalize you using Panda. The next module I want to look at is Penguin. Now, this part of the algorithm doesn't have a specific implication for Magento, but if you're hit by this overnight, it can break your business. Once again, Penguin is another module within the algorithm that's designed to penalize your site, and its primary function is to look at the quality of the links pointing to your site. Think of links like votes. They're one of the strongest ranking signals there are at the moment. And in the past, people used to cheat and create artificial links. And this is why Google had to create Penguin. So how do you know if you've been hit by Penguin? Well, if you see a sudden drop in your analytics around the same date as a confirmed update, then you can be pretty confident you've been hit by Penguin. The worst thing about this is that when it comes to recovery, there really are very few success stories out there. It hits quick, and it hits hard. And if you think in any time in the past you might have employed someone to build links on your behalf, I'd really encourage you to get a link audit. Sadly, Penguin and Panda aren't the only things you need to worry about. Google has a team of people working full-time scouring the internet, each and every day looking for content they deem to be of low quality. They have the power to serve you a manual penalty, and you'll hear about this through your webmaster tools. There are a number of factors they're looking for, and these are all outlined in a 160-page document from Google, and there are leaked copies of this floating all over the internet. For example, did you realize that because your site's an e-commerce site, that Google is harsher when it assesses it for quality? It categorizes you in a section that they call your money or your life. And in the excerpt provided, you can see their reasoning behind this. I haven't included a link on the slide to the document in question, but if anyone actually wants a link to this and they want to read more about this document from Google, if you just shoot me an email, I'll point you in the right direction. So the final module I want to talk about is the disavow tool. So this is a portal that exists within Webmaster Tools, and you can upload a whole load of links you'd like Google to ignore. Just remember that the problem with the disavow tool is Google only treat the information you present in this as a recommendation, and when they ignore links from the disavow tool, they don't treat it as the same as having a completely clean link profile. So now that we've covered most of the modules within the algorithm, let's take a look at Hummingbird. So Hummingbird was released back in September 2013. And Hummingbird was a rewrite to the core algorithm. It's different from everything we've looked at up to now because it wasn't built to penalize you. Hummingbird was in fact a real game changer, and it was designed to change the way that Google processes queries. This is the one update that has had the most significant effect and should have been the catalyst that made everyone change their ranking strategy. So in order to understand how it works, it's important to look how things have changed. And the best way to do that is to look at how things were prior to the update. So if you take a look at the SERP results here, you can see it doesn't look particularly different from today, except for maybe the ads have a yellow background, which you can't really see on this slide very well. But what I've tried to do is highlight in black, which you probably can't see very well, that the key phrases in the search bar exactly match the key phrases in the top organic listing. And really, there's no surprises here. But what we can learn from this is that pre-Hummingbird, the site with the best exact keyword targeting and the one with the most links was the one that topped organic listings. So how has this changed? What happened when we changed post the Hummingbird update? So in this example, I tapped into Google, how tall is the AMP Tower in Sydney? Now what's interesting in this is the keywords up in the search bar no longer exactly match the top organic listing. Hummingbird has something that they call semantic processing, which means it recognizes synonyms of the keywords in the search. It knew, for example, that the AMP Tower is now called the Sydney Tower. And it also knew that the phrase how tall meant the same thing as when you ask what is the height of. Not only that, we're now getting a direct answer to our question in the search result by taking advantage of something called the knowledge graph. So what can we learn from this? Well, in short, if you're still using the same old techniques of just focusing on exact keyword matching and building as many links as you can, you might not be as effective as you once were. You need to start to focus on something that Google calls user intent. And you need to start thinking about answering questions. And wherever possible, you need to start building structured data on your site so you can make use of the knowledge graph. So before I take a step into the ranking factors for 2015, I wanted to just have a quick review. So hopefully now, when you look at this picture, you can see it will be a little bit less confusing to you. You can see that each query is processed using Hummingbird, and then in real time, any negative signals are fed in to return a final result. So Hummingbird was almost 2 years ago, and Google's algorithm has continued to develop since then. There are now so many other ranking factors and signals that trying to create an infographic for 2015 is a little bit too complicated. So I'm just going to run through them individually, one slide at a time. So back in April this year, Google released the mobile-friendly update. This caused so much grief for some people that it's been described as the Mobile-ageddon update. It is important to note that it only affects search on a mobile device, but with 29% of all search being conducted on mobile, this is still a signal you can't afford to ignore. The next signal is site speed, and it doesn't really take that much explaining, but the importance of this can't really be stressed enough. We all know with Magento it can be a real challenge to get it running fast, especially if you're not using CDNs and caching. And you can be looking at load times of 7 seconds. Now for me is not really the right time to talk about how to speed up your site, especially in current company, and we know that next week at the Port 80 they're tackling this exact subject. But I will leave you with one tip. Please try never to use Google Analytics to assess site speed. It's hugely inaccurate, and there are much better free tools out there like Web Page Speed Test. So engagement is the key area that Google's focusing on at the moment. And it's a real opportunity if you can nail it. Google is all about offering their users a great experience. And in their mind, engagement is a great metric for measuring the quality of their referrals. Google will be looking at your browse rate, they'll be looking at the average time spent on your site, and they'll also be looking at average page depth and bounce rates. And they do this because they're looking for a behavior known as pogo sticking. So pogo sticking is when Google sends you to a site and then you immediately return back to the search results and you select the next item in the list. They can pretty safely assume that if you return straight away, the content didn't match the user's intent. Not only are they looking at people's behavior when trying to search for something, they're also looking for how many people are talking about your content and your brand online, be it comments, links, tweets, or shares. They're trying to identify just one thing. Who is the site with the most authority to answer this question? Now, I want to say that again. Who is the site, no longer the page, how it used to be, with the most authority, rather than links, to answer this question? So before we step into the next section and look at Magento, I just want to quickly recap. If you can match user intent rather than just focusing on keywords, make full use of the knowledge graph, create engaging content with a great UX on both mobile and desktop, you're going to be well ahead of the curve and have all the ingredients for success for now and well into the future. Okay, so now let's take a look at how we can configure Magento. So e-commerce sites, especially Magento, they offer a very different challenge compared to normal content-driven websites like WordPress. I mean, we have to be realistic here. It's not always easy to write good, engaging content that's going to earn you a ton of links when you're selling $10 widgets online. E-commerce sites are all about making your site easy to crawl, and you need to make sure you don't serve too much duplicate content or broken links. It's about cleaning up your site and paying attention to the signals that Panda's looking for. So the best way to deal with Panda is to manage your duplicates and your out-of-stock inventory. And this can be done through a series of redirects, canonicals, and settings in the Magento admin. My first tip for Panda is to do with URL structures. So by default, we all know that Magento creates a load of different product URLs depending on which category your product exists in. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you the setting that for me is by far the most important one in your Magento admin. You need to log in and go under System and Configuration. And then you need to go into Catalog and Search Engine Optimizations. And you need to make sure that these two tags are set to yes. If you do this, it will stop Magento from serving a bunch of duplicate content. The next tip is going to the HTML improvement sections in Webmaster Tools. You want to be looking at duplicate meta descriptions and duplicate title tags, and you want to be making sure that it contains no duplicates. And whilst you're in Webmaster Tools, you want to have a look at crawl errors. The most common error I see time and time again from our clients is when they disable a product in Magento, and they always forget to redirect that disabled product to a category page. Trying to get on top of this can be a really daunting task, and if you look in Webmaster Tools, at first you may see thousands and thousands of errors. But once you do get on top of it and you manage it, you'll really see that it pays dividends. My final Panda top tip is to do with managing parameters. So most Magento sites give you the ability to filter by a custom attribute when you're on that page. So in the example I've given you here, I've highlighted in yellow what the URL is. So when I as a user click on it and I try and filter by a different attribute, you can see that the actual URL changes. When this URL changes, Google treats this like a new page and it tries to index it, but it's totally unnecessary. There's no new content on this page whatsoever. And the interesting thing about this is if you look at this example of this one client, and just by looking at one single parameter, I can tell you that it creates just under 23,000 additional pages on this one site alone. It's quite easy to manage this, and you need to once again go into Google Webmaster Tools. But if you don't know what you're doing, or you're a little bit unsure about parameters, I would seriously recommend getting someone who knows what they're doing to manage this, because you could end up blocking some content that you really need the site to see. So moving on from Panda, our next tip is for adding the knowledge graph markup into the code for your website. I've had some really fantastic results from my clients by doing this, and it's pretty straightforward. There are a number of extensions out there to do this, but I find it's much easier to just edit the product page template on Magento. I've included some links to schema.org on how to do this, and also Google's structured data testing tool. And any front-end developer should be able to implement this without any problems at all. Just because your site is responsive or it has a good mobile theme, it doesn't mean to say that Google is going to deem this mobile friendly. I reviewed quite a number of sites over the last few months, and for me there's 3 common errors that keep cropping up again and again. So the first one is when a perfectly good mobile site has an out-of-date robot.txt file. So what does this mean? This means that when this file isn't correctly configured, it can block Google from reading the appropriate CSS, and it makes it impossible for Google to recognize it as a mobile-friendly site. The second one is configuring something called the viewport. Now the viewport is a tag that allows you to, well, it allows for the fact that all mobile phones have different resolutions and different screen sizes. And just by setting this tag to device width can make all of the difference. The final one is by leaving enough space between buttons and tap targets. You need to leave at least 5 pixels in between these buttons, and although that's usually adhered to, it's often forgotten down in places like the footer links. The last thing I'm going to talk about tonight is about how to deal with a penguin or a manual penalty. The best tool still really is prevention, and if you make sure you keep on top of your backlinks by checking them in Webmaster Tools, you just need to ask yourself whether you need to disavow these links if you think they're a threat or not. Being hit by one of these penalties can break your business overnight, and even though there are procedures out there for recovering from these, the process can take months. And even then you can't necessarily expect the traffic to return to the same levels. In the unfortunate event that you are hit by one of these, you need to be able to display to Google that you contacted all the webmasters from the suspect links and asked for them to be removed. You also need, not only once, you need to be able to show them that you've done that twice. Only then will they let you use the disavow tool. So you've heard a lot tonight, and I hope it gives you some food for thought. The most powerful way to tame Magento and to achieve success is to keep your duplicates, redirects, and out-of-stock products under control. And if you can build on that with engaging content that fulfills user intent, then you have a foolproof strategy, not only just for 2015, but for many more years to come. Thank you.
Any questions at all?
Are you going to share that present?
Sorry?
Are you going to share that present?
I'll share it.
Absolutely, yeah.
You said one of the key issues was keeping your inventory out of stock, items out of in control.
Yeah.
Define that. What do you mean?
So what-
Unpublished, delete, remove?
So what happens is Magento has built within it, it's under, I think it's under catalog, the URL rewrite management tool. So if you just disable a product, let's say someone's bookmarked that in the past, when they try and visit that page in the future, they'll get what's called a 404, so an error on that page. So what you can do is when you disable that product, you can make a note of that, it's called the URL key in that field, and you go into URL rewrite management, and you just create a redirect of where you would like them to go when that's out of stock.
Okay, so if it's a temporary issue, it's not a big issue, but if it's a permanent out of stock issue, clean it up.
Well, the important thing is, you know, like we talked about engagement and user experience. So even if it's a temporary issue, I mean, what we do at Acid Green is we get the back-end developers to create a script so that as soon as something's disabled, it will just automatically direct to the parent category. But if you don't have the benefit of that script, you can use the URL rewrite tool.
If you've actually created that problem, how do you recover from it? Like if you've got thousands of things that no longer point anywhere, but you've actually created a complete new index site, everything behind it, how do you recover from it?
So you just need, so what's great is within Webmaster Tools, it will give you a list of all the broken links, and you can download that directly from Webmaster Tools. So you can, there's a few ways you can do it, and the guys of Anchor have taught me better ways of doing it actually. So originally I used to use an extension which is called Mass 301 Redirect, where you just put a column on the left of all the old links and then a column on the right of all the new links you want. But what we realized is as that file builds up, it actually slows down the site significantly, because before it serves a 404, it has to pass all of those. So the best way to manage it is, if you've got an Nginx server, is to use the web configuration files. Anchor might have to help me out with this, I think. or if it's an Apache server on HTAccess, but I'm not sure. James is our technical lead. He can help you with that.
So like, yeah, the sitemaps will change, but all those old existing links, it doesn't realise that they've disappeared type thing? You can't just turn them off?
No, well you see, old links are like the most powerful thing. So a common thing we'll get at Acid Green is someone who's not originally on Magento would say, I want to start using Magento. And if we don't redirect all their old links from their old website to the new website, it loses all of its SEO juice, all of its rankings, and it can really hurt your rankings. So you have to work pretty hard to earn that domain authority in those rankings. And it really is worth the investment to kind of continue those by creating redirects.
So just a question. You talked about measuring the page speed.
Yeah.
You said that Google Analytics wasn't worth looking at.
Yeah.
Did you mean that, or was that Google page speed tools?
No, I meant analytics. And at first, I used to use analytics to measure page speed, because 99% of the time that's what I'm in and that's what I'm talking to my clients about. We're looking at analytics together. And it was only when I started working with the technical lead at our company and the guys at Squixer that they made me realise that it only takes a sample of data and it doesn't really give you that much data. And on one of the slides I've given you a link to Web Page Speed Test, which I think is something you guys sponsor anyway. But it's a free service. You just put the URL in, and it gives you an exact it tells you exactly how long it takes to load everything. But it also gives you a list of all the things that are slowing the site down and things like that. It's just far more useful using that. Yeah.
Any other questions? Mark, do you want to give a really brief overview of Acid Green? You guys are sponsoring tonight. There you go, like 10 seconds kind of thing. If everyone doesn't.
I'm just looking at my boss here.
Does Jay or somebody? Does it manual?
Not particularly. All I would say is, and Mike, you can pick me up on whether I say anything wrong here, but we only do Magento. We specialise in Magento. And that's what we're good at, and we work pretty hard at, focusing on that. So me heading up the SEO side of the business, I'm only dealing with Magento sites every day. So some of these tips I've shared with you, which are really simple, you just log in and you type these all in. Some of these took me months and a lot longer and a lot of years of experience to work out what works for you. So if you have got a Magento site and you want an agency who can not only help develop the site and get the most out of the site, but full service who can help you with the digital marketing, I think Acid Green are the right people. What do you think, Mike?
Okay. Awesome. Thanks, mate. Well done. So we're going to go to pizzas. We're just waiting for them to be delivered. But I just want to stress that we've only just taken this meetup over, and we want suggestions. So if anybody wants any content, any particular talks, any subjects, please just chuck it into the meetup, and we'll look to coordinate it. Okay. And that's about it. Everyone have a drink, have a talk, have something to eat when it turns up, and we'll look to repeat this every month. Thanks, guys.